Today we're at the Europe Future Forum put on by Vejvoda Insight, and joining me today is Ivan Vejvoda, Permanent Fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, in your work, you've emphasized the importance of democracy in Europe, and given the rise of populist movements, increasing polarization that we're seeing on the continent, first of all, do you believe that this can erode democratic institutions, and what exactly can be done to safeguard these institutions in the future?
Indeed, I believe that populism is a dangerous feature arising in democratic countries. Of course, we are in a world where autocracy and authoritarian behavior of politicians is on the rise, so this is the bigger context in which this is happening. But focusing on Europe, certainly the rise of the far right and on the far left as well, we see populism, which is basically pandering to some very simplistic fears, deep fears that people have about the uncertainty of the future. And they erode what is a normal democratic process. Now, of course, there is also fragmentation in society, the depletion of mainstream parties, and we see a political spectrum where, in fact, people are trying to find the answer to what is the uncertainty of tomorrow in their lives. So the way to do this is mobilization of voters on themes and, of course, responsive political parties to the worries that people have. We see the rise of the far right in Germany in the recent elections. In Austria, where I'm currently living, we will have elections on September the 29th, where probably the far right party will come out first. So that means that politicians have to listen to the people. I think that's the first answer to your question: how do we tackle this issue? And then, of course, need to find adequate responses to those fears.
But isn't at the same time, isn't this just a consequence of open societies and democracy at the same time?
Of course, democracy is not given on a silver plate, and people have to fight for it. All the democratic values that we have, all the benefits that we have, human rights, the rule of law, were fought for in the streets and institutions over 2 centuries. And so there's nothing that can guarantee the persistence of democracy. It needs to be fought for every morning when one wakes up, because there's always forces of evil. Unfortunately, we saw that in the worst form in European history in the last century, in the 1930s, with the rise of fascism and Nazism, and we thought that these things could not come back. But social issues, economic hardship of people, unemployment, and of course this fear that many people have that artificial intelligence and the digital world will leave them without jobs, are things that people live with every day. And that's why I think there's been a sort of situation in the political field where political parties that have been used to another kind of world before these technological changes have not found the adequate response. And that is why we are seeing a reconfiguration of the political arena.
And do you believe that somewhat the mainstream parties are at least partially to blame because they're not addressing these issues that are indeed being exploited, say, by the far right?
I agree with you. The mainstream parties, some of which have disappeared, like in Italy, for example, over the past 2 decades, or in France, we see that as well with the rise of Emmanuel Macron's party, which is a sort of conglomerate of left and right. And we see that with this situation where France finds itself for the first time in a situation where they have to create a coalition government. So all this is an expression of what you rightly say is a lack of capacity to address in the immediate those things that worry people the most.
I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the war in Ukraine. It's reshaped Europe, at least in the geopolitical context. How do you envision this conflict influencing the future of European security and Europe's role on a global stage?
Well, that's certainly the foremost important question that we all need to address. I would like to equate what happened with the full-scale Russian invasion on February 24 in 2022 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. For me, these are epoch-changing moments where everything is different. And I think that Europe was in a sort of lull, not understanding what Russia could do, the dependency on Russian cheap gas, the dependency on American security umbrella. These are things that are no longer there. And Europe has to, I think, fundamentally, and it is already taking important steps to change that, to realize that it has to create the capacity to defend itself. This will not happen overnight. Countries are beginning to spend more money. Poland is a case in point that has taken this very seriously and has moved forward in understanding that defense and security capacities need to be upgraded. And then to change energy supply, move away from the dependency on Russian gas and oil. That is probably moved faster, but still a lot needs to be done. But in a larger sense, Europe needs to understand that in a world where the United States and China are dominant, where Europe's position in the world economy, however strong it is falling, with the decline of demography as well, there will have to be some very bold decisions taken for Europe to secure its place and voice in the world. It remains a magnet. Everybody wants to come to Europe. People are not migrating to China or to Russia or to wherever else because life is still, with all of the problems, good in Europe. There's rule of law, there's a sense of freedom, and there is opportunity. But all that requires, if it is to remain the way it is, decisions that need to be, I think, made in a shorter term. And among that is the issue of enlarging the European Union. Clearly, Ukraine is an important future member. So is Moldova, but also let's not forget the Western Balkans that are not yet integrated. Europe has to prove that it can integrate. How else will it tackle problems in the nearer neighborhood, like the Middle East, not to mention others?
Do you believe that Europe, since the Cold War, embraced Russia too much, maybe not enough? And what does the future look like post-conflict in Ukraine for Russia?
Well, certainly the euphoria that took us all over after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the fact that everybody thought that now democracy was sailing on the highway without obstacles in any direction, had this rude wake-up call that things were not easy. Did we embrace Russia in the way we should have? When I say we, the West, broadly writ, yes, I think initially. Were there mistakes in that embrace? Certainly as well. Not understanding that after 70 years of communism in the Soviet Union, which is different from the 40 years that the rest of us had in this part of the world, leaves consequences which are very dire. And, you know, without belaboring the point, we get to a Russia that feels betrayed, that feels left out, and then we have an imperial Putin who wants to reconfigure his country in the way that it existed, creating a total catastrophe for everyone, where with the invasion, Ukraine is really fighting for the freedom of Europe. I would say that very emphatically. Nobody wants an invader in their living room. And I think that's what some people in Europe do not understand, why the Ukrainians are ready to sacrifice themselves in this heroic manner. Well, it's very simply to preserve their basic freedom.
Now, how do you see Europe addressing the growing tension between the need for unity within the European Union and differing national interests, of member states in the upcoming years?
Well, Europe is certainly a unique experiment, quote unquote, in this world. It is not a federation. It is not an authoritarian construct. I'm talking about the United States and China, where the state can overnight decide, let's put 10 billion into something, or have a government which has the authority to sort of tax or do something. Europe is a conglomerate of 27 states. Some people want it to become a federation. I don't think it will. It's always been an in-between of sovereign member states giving part of their sovereignty to a center, and a European Commission that is a sort of a European government. So that's the beauty and the difficulty that Europe has. But throughout the period since its creation in 1957, it has managed to go through a number of crises, and this is probably the biggest one. It's a poly-crisis, in fact. There are financial issues, there's migration, there's the Russian invasion, and then the challenge of what's called a G2 world, a world of the United States and China. I believe, not only do I believe in Europe, but I believe Europe will be able to find solutions. It's often messy, it looks messy. There are these differences, and unfortunately, I must say it openly, there are countries, member states like Hungary, that are backsliding in democracy and that are unfortunately impeding a unified voice on Ukraine, for example, or impeding quicker decisions in Ukraine. And I think Europe has not found a way to tackle countries like Hungary who have gone or going and moving in the other direction, and who are actually trying to change the European Union from inside to make it much more a club of 27 sovereign states with having less joint decision making. This is the internal challenge that I see foremost for the European Union.
Final question. If we look at the situation in Ukraine, indeed, we saw Europe unite like never before in such an issue, but Russia is it's a local threat to Europe. But if we look a little further away, if we look to China, will a similar response as Europe as a whole, will it be more fragmented towards the policy towards Europe, or does it have a potential to be unified and in step across the Atlantic with the United States?
Yes, you are right to point out that China is a different challenge, a less unified approach. We see that with a number of European leaders going to China individually to try and find ways in which they can shore up their trade and their economic relationships, because the intensity of the economic relationship that China has, first of all with the United States, is huge, and people don't realize China owns a huge amount of American debt. Big companies have their production lines, whether it's Tesla or Apple from the American side, German car factories, you name. The Spanish prime minister was in China. So it's a different level of challenge. China, on the other hand, knows that it needs Europeans and Americans to keep its economy going. So there's a deeper understanding that there is an interconnection, but there's also the competition. And the famous word of de-risking or decoupling, which is more dramatic, but I don't think there will be a decoupling, because everybody needs the trade and commerce and mutual investment that there is with China. So I think we're walking on eggshells here, both China, the EU, and the United States. There's, of course, the Chinese threat of invading Taiwan. Personally, I don't think that will happen in the immediate future. And the number of visits that there are between Chinese and American leaders and between European and Chinese tells me that there is a search for a solution which would mitigate the possibility of a bigger clash.
Okay, well, Ivan Vejvoda, Permanent Fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, thank you very much for this discussion. Very much appreciated.
Thank you for the invitation.